been a discovery of what's happening in Indian cities for ourselves as a part of the project. Our project was dealing with with the structural issue about how urban planning, which has been envisioned as a benign modernist intervention in the cities, actually play out. And it acts as a structural condition within which everyday violence is experienced by large number of population, including especially the urban poor. We dealt with multiple segments of urban areas. We dealt with housing and land. We dealt with public transport and women's safety in that, and we also dealt with spaces for vending in cities and how there are conflicts around it. I'm only going to speak today more about land and housing because it's something that's very dear to me, but it's also very important if we were to create cities which are inclusive and safe. The context that I am speaking from is the capitalist global south, especially India, which is transiting and aspiring to have a very high growth rate and be the next global engine of growth. And that's been aspired through what we call urban development, and it's been said that cities are going to be the engines of growth, and that's where the major structural violence on people starts to build on. What has happened in India's urbanization process is that cities have expanded through market initiatives. That's the private market that's led the development of the cities. It's the private sector led push post 1991 when India opened up, and that's what we call economic reforms. I hesitate to use neoliberal term because we never had a welfare economy to begin with, and so this transition to opening of the markets that we see is not based on withdrawal of the state from the welfare space. It never existed for the poor, and poor existed in the interstices of cities and the informal settlements and urban peripheries. What has happened differently in last 10 years, especially when much large-scale investments in urban sector began to unfold from 2006 onwards, particularly with large state public investments in urban infrastructure projects and even in housing. That's where we start seeing that evictions of informal activities from the cities. Largely, there have been a lot of displacements that have occurred because of the infrastructure and even public housing programs. So two things simultaneously happen: that pre-reforms when with lower rate of growth and real estate not being the engine of growth in the cities, poor did find spaces in the informal sector in central parts of the city, and they survived through their own devices. Post-reforms, when there has been aspiration to push high economic growth rates, that's where lands become crucial. Real estate sector has experienced the highest growth rate in the national GDP, and that's also happening at the local level. And that's where large-scale projects are being envisioned: malls, commercials, different kinds of commercial development, high real estate housing projects, and so on. And so the lands that were occupied by the poor are become very precious and very high valued, and that's where the evictions begin to happen. And so that is where, and it also has increased the real estate prices in the cities. And so you see a very steep curve from the center to the periphery in terms of real estate price increase. And so the new poor coming in, or poor who are wanting to expand their housing requirements, are pushed to the periphery through markets. Or else you have situations where poor are living in the middle of the city in the informal settlements, get pushed out onto the periphery through either public housing programs of resettlement or are just evicted out. And then they find spaces in the informal settlements on the urban periphery. So what we find is peripheralization of the cities where poor tend to be pushed into the margins on the peripheries through forces of through actions of the state as well as forces of the market. And so we say in Indian context that both market and state have failed the urban poor in housing situation. It's in this context that this study is being envisioned. We have two cities. This is our research team. And it's a very young, dynamic team that we had. Everybody has learned quite a bit out of this research. We had, right from the beginning, NGO partners, and we had taken up research areas which were of interest to them. Our research focused on, we picked up two contradictory cities, Ahmedabad and Guwahati. I'm just going to give a little bit of flavor of the housing in the two cities. Ahmedabad is 6.5 million and Guwahati is 1 million. And Ahmedabad has had a very long history of communal violence and also caste violence. It's been a state, it's in a state which has experienced very high growth rate, very high urbanization rates, but also very high violence, communal violence, and very low human development status. And that's the paradigm of growth that Ahmedabad city represents. And Guwahati is in a low income, low economic growth state fraught with long established ethnic violence in the northeast of India. And that's the contrasting situation in which we have picked up the study. Three study locales, where one was an informal housing settlement on the Ahmedabad's periphery, which has its own very specific history. At this moment, we may honestly say that we are not sure whether the same dynamics could be seen in the other peripheral settlements, but this settlement came up post-2002 communal violence, where Muslims were attacked by the Hindu right wing, and Muslims shifted to, a large number of Muslims shifted to this settlement that we have picked up, which has about 25,000 households, about 125 to 150,000 people, 100% Muslim community. A part of them have been resettled here because of 2002 violence by the Muslim charity organizations, or not finding any space. The city is completely segmented on caste and religion lines. And so this is one of the large areas in continuum on the southern west, southwestern periphery of city where Muslims are living today in Ahmedabad city. The second area is the hill settlements on Guwahati. I'm not sure whether you see the pictures clearly, they're not very good. Hill settlements of Guwahati has come up in the context of the land regime in that state. Land is owned by the state and it's given on concession to the tribal communities that have been inhabiting there. Because of the peculiar location of the city, there have been trends of migrants coming in from all other northeastern states, and this becomes the gateway to northeast of India. So it's a commercial city, new educational institutions have come up, and there's been a requirement of land. So the state has begun to acquire lands that were owned traditionally by tribal communities, and tribals have got pushed to live on the margins of the city, and one of the areas that they have gone and occupied is the hills, because this is a city of also hills and wetlands. It's a very, very fragile ecological context within which the housing is happening. And so there are multiple conflicts, including conflict with the nature, but also issues that I'm going to talk about. And third is a resettlement site. Because when state comes in, and Ahmedabad has seen large amount of displacement because it's an active state promoting actively urban infrastructure programs. And so it has caused the number of slums within the city have got evicted. And at that time when these evictions were happening, there was a national program called Basic Services for the Urban Poor under a very large urban renewal program for which funds were available to rehabilitate. And so about 200,000 to 300,000 people have been rehabilitated in last 10 years on the city's periphery in the kind of housing that are there. So what we see is that whether there is planning or no planning, when planning comes, there is violence. When the planning doesn't exist, there is violence in the informal sector, and that's the story that I want to present today. What we see in this informal so these are the two sites, both of them are on the periphery of Ahmedabad city. And Guwahati also, the sites are on the periphery of the city, and the yellow line is the national highway. Now I want to tell you the story of this high density informal development, which is a large Muslim ghetto on the periphery of Ahmedabad. How do we see why would one see kind of everyday conflicts? And our story is also about everyday conflicts that is experienced. The story is that the entire development has occurred through active engagement of non-state actors. They're acting, there are developers who have purchased land from the farmers, plotted it and sold them to the occupants. Obviously, this is all without any kind of regulatory or control. There are non-state actors in the water supply sectors who are coercive in terms of asking for collection of money. They are not responsive to the local community who are purchasing water from them. There are spurious kind of land bookings, so there could be two owners of one plot, and there would be conflict between them. There are some plots which are vacant in this development, and so you have some goons, as we call them, local gundas, who come and occupy them and then start extracting money from the informal owners who have purchased this land through coercive measures. So we see various forms of coercive measures present in this settlement. We have done different papers on it, and it's been available on our website, so I'm not going into great details in it. Other thing that we find, and so this is primarily because there is no state present in this sector, in this area today in terms of service delivery. Recently, the state came in, then they came in with say that they want to implement a local planning scheme here. If that was to be done, 15% of the households would have got evicted out, and there was a mobilization around it. And at the moment, there is a compromise between the local community and the municipal government. So they're going to minimize the evictions that will be required for putting in water sanitation lines. The site does not have proper roads, no street lights, and so one would envisage that these are areas which are in the nights don't feel safe, especially safe for women. You have paratransit, that is auto rickshaws flying. Women don't like traveling in those kind of vehicles because they don't feel safe. And lastly, because these are peripheral sites in Ahmedabad city, and this was a big discovery for us, that there are many kind of illicit activities ongoing. Ahmedabad is the city where alcohol is prohibited. That is, the state has an alcohol prohibition. And so lots of spurious alcohol being brewed here, and you see finds of drug peddling, young, and this comes in when there's also very high youth unemployment. So it gets into a heady mix of a cocktail where there is everyday violence experience. And so this is the picture of how the plan has happened. In the peripheral site of Ahmedabad, in Guwahati, you have the similar informal settlement where as I said, that lands belong to the state, and the entire city has developed through a process of what we call encroachments. There's no private ownership of land in here. And the state owns and it starts giving concessions. So you need to have political power to manipulate the state to get land rights in particular locations. Now, the tribal communities being pushed to the periphery are feeling alienated in the state. There are multiple other dynamics of tribal communities being alienated in the state, and as a result, there have been multiple evictions in these hill settlements in last about 7-8 years. Because tribals have been evicted and they feel alienated in the state, which they thought they belong, they are the indigenous people of the state. And so they begin to organize, and there is a very massive mobilization on land rights movement in this. The leader of the movement is very well known in India. Akhil Gogoi is a very militant housing rights activist of the state and in India. And so there have been incidences, and while we were there, we saw this mobilization of, there was a recent eviction and around which people mobilized, and they hit back at the state. When the police came to evict, they hit back. The state hit back. And so there is a chain of violence and counter-violence that persists, and it has not happened once, it has happened multiple times. And in that process, one of the persons said that if we don't get land rights by so-and-so date, etc., I'm going to immolate myself, and the person immolated himself. My research colleague was present on the site at that time. And after that, there was multiple meetings, and the state sort of gave in and have said that they will give land rights, and it's a long, tedious process of giving land rights here. And lastly, the rehabilitation is occurring because as a part of the new urban agenda, there have been projects of rebranding city, and this is one of the sort of key project of the city, which is Sabarmati Riverfront Development Project. This is water. This is not a perennial river. This river has got water from River Narmada, thousands of kilometers away, where thousands of tribals have been evicted out, and water has been brought in for water sports for the large city. And so there is an inherent inequity in this situation itself. And then some other beautification projects. This is a lake beautification project. So this is what we see in large scale in many of the cities here. These are kind of projects that are ongoing. And people who get evicted out then get pushed into the periphery, into kind of public housing that we see. And what we see as a result is on the periphery, this is a very specific, because even rehabilitation is occurring according to religious communities. So Muslims are living in one side, Hindus are living in one side, they are refusing to live with each other and so on. So there are multiple everyday conflicts between the communities that are there. And this is the kind of new housing that they have been provided, which is very poor. If you go inside this, right now we are doing another study, in this you find 40 to 42 degree temperature inside this house, because these are concrete houses, and it just absorbs heat, and you can't live in these houses in summer. There are water issues around, and I don't have time now. So what you see is one example I want to give. When people have lost employment, women have moved out of job markets, there are transport issues, there are water supply issues. Water is the situation that you see. Water is not potable. There are issues of maintenance and governance, water governance in this site. So each of this have been written up as a paper, and so I'm not going into details. And so the people who were living in the center of the city with access to jobs and livelihood for men and women both have, especially women, have moved out of the labor market because they can't commute to their former places of work. This is a story of multiple rehabilitation sites. So what I want to conclude with is that, and on rehabilitation sites, I want to say one thing that's been much higher: unemployment, lack of social cohesion, illicit activities, vandalism, and so on. But especially all sites, in this study and all other studies that we have done, women say, I am afraid of sending my daughter out alone now on the rehabilitation sites, because there is illegal activities going on the terraces, there is no control, no management of commons that exist in the sites, and so we cannot fight this gundas, we cannot fight this lukhas is a term that we use particularly in Indian context, and they say the life has become hell after moving to rehabilitation sites. So what do we do? Is urban planning a benign project for India? Is making Indian cities global, world-class, whatever, now we call ourselves smart cities, whatever is the program, are we going to move towards this with this kind of actual dynamics on the ground? Currently, there is no recognition of that how cities are transforming. What is happening to the lives of the people living in informal settlements, in low-income housing settlements, etc. We need to look at the housing policy, the land policy in the cities, and I think we could have a chat on this more when we have the World Cafe and the subsequent events in this, and one could say more what needs to be done. The two things, last thing I want to say is that we need to look at urban planning as a profession. It's discipline, in which we do two things, and what we do needs to be looked at, and how we do needs to be looked at. It's both the substantive part of urban planning and the process part of urban planning needs to be re-looked at it. Fortunately, this has been recognized by a number of planning schools in India, and hopefully we'll be able to move ahead from here. Thank you.